but we'll jump right in here. Thank you, everyone, for logging in, for attending today. We know this is a little bit strange, a little bit unusual, but that's kind of where we're at. So please do bear with us. We are still kind of working through the kinks of our strategy for holding these types of meetings fully online. So we will go kind of through some ground rules in just a minute here, but I would just ask that you bear with us full of the ground rules. And also, if you have any ideas or suggestions on how we might do these better in the future, we would absolutely welcome that type of feedback anytime. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to McKenna. She's going to do just a quick introduction and lay out some ground rules of how we're going to conduct this meeting today. So McKenna.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the meeting. If you were at our last meeting, we're following the same structure. So as far as the webinar instructions go, to help avoid any echoes and other audio issues, we do ask that you remain muted unless you are speaking. So if you would like to speak, you can type your name in the chat box and we will call on you when there is a pause for questions and comments. And I will go ahead and let you know that you can speak, and I can unmute you if you're having issues unmuting yourself for any reason. So I'll let you know when that will happen, so you'll be prepared to speak. And then if you would prefer to type your questions and comments into the chat, you can do that as well, and Maggie will be reading those throughout the meeting. And then lastly, this meeting is recorded.
McKenna. Welcome, everyone. This is a meeting of the 5th Management Plans Work Group. We're an ADWR-led stakeholder group for the development of the 5th Management Plans. My name is Natalie Mast. I am the program manager working on the management plans here at ADWR. I have a handful of staff on the webinar helping me out today. So I'll kind of go through each of them and introduce everybody. Carol Ward is our Deputy Assistant Director for Planning and Permitting here at ADWR. She is going to be helping out with some of the presentation today, so you'll hear from her in a little bit here. We also have McKenna, who you just heard, who is kind of running the back end of the webinar, helping mute and unmute people and that type of thing. We have Amanda Long Rodriguez, who is running our presentation today. So thank you, Amanda, for helping out with that. Maggie Martin is going to be helping out with the comments as they come in through the chat box. So as McKenna said, you can either submit written comments, write your comments into the chat box, or ask to be unmuted, and we'll call on people as they come in. So Maggie's going to be helping out with that piece. And Teresa Johnson is also on the webinar helping out. You can message Teresa directly if you have any technical issues or need any assistance in running with the webinar technical things. So thank you to all of them. This is definitely a team effort to get these webinars together. So we appreciate kind of that collaborative effort over here. As I said, my name is Natalie. We're going to be going through a few things today. Amanda, if you could go to the next slide, please. Two main pieces on our agenda today. The first item, we're going through some of our main issues, key issues for the 5th management plans. There's two pieces to that presentation on those key issues, but what we're going to do is wait until the very end of that first chunk to pause for questions and comments. The way we have it structured today, I think a lot of your questions might be answered through the course of that presentation. So we'll stop after item 2 on the agenda there and take questions or comments. And then the next piece will be, I'll be providing updates from the progress that we're making in each of our subgroups. And we'll pause for questions and comments with each subgroup in that section on number 3 there on the agenda. So let's go ahead and dive in. So Amanda, if you could, thank you, perfect. As I said, we are wanting to use some of this time that we have today to talk about some of the key issues that we are going to be focusing on for the 5th management plans. We've talked a lot about data and kind of what we want to think about for these 5th management plans, and we're really hoping our conversation today can provide a little bit of focus to how we're going to approach and how we are approaching those 5th management plans. So if you'd go to the next slide, please. The first piece of that is I'm going to do a run through of the statutory requirements that we have for these 5th management plans. As many of you know, these management plans were created under the Groundwater Management Act. So there are a list of things, a framework set forth in those statutes that kind of give us some guidance and give us some principles by which we build these management plans. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Great. So big picture. We have management goals for each active management area. The management plans are intended to be a tool, and they're an important part of the tools that we have under the Groundwater Management Act to move our active management areas toward their goals. So the goals are slightly different in the Penn and Santa Cruz AMAs, and we know that each AMA is unique and has its flavor, its things that make it slightly different than the other AMAs. That's why we have a management plan for each AMA, and that's why we have the option to tweak and customize these programs to fit the needs of each active management area and to continue making progress toward the goal of each active management area. Slide. So that said, there is an overarching theme for how we build these management plans to move the AMAs toward their goals. If in any of these meetings you've heard me say this, you're going to hear me say it again. The method in which we can make progress toward the goal in each AMA is by reducing withdrawals of groundwater. The conservation programs in these plans are to be designed to reduce withdrawals of groundwater. So, big picture, on the AMA scale, this is what we're going for. This is the box that we need to check in everything that we do. We are designing conservation programs to reduce withdrawals of groundwater. If we could go to the next slide, please. The sequence here. These plans are intended to be iterative, with each subsequent plan increasing conservation requirements and expanding on the previous plan. This is demonstrated in the way the statutes are written, where you have 5 management plans for each active management area, and there are additional options that come in with subsequent management plans to help us continue moving the AMAs toward their goals. So I'm going to kind of go through this list here, starting with the first management plans. We shall have water duties for agriculture, and we shall have municipal and industrial conservation programs. The second management plans expanded on this and kept the previous requirements and split out programs for small municipal providers, for large untreated providers. 2 MPs, second management plans also created a requirement for the plan to contain a municipal non-per capita program and conservation assistance program. And it expanded on the background information that was required to be in each plan. So you can see kind of in that 2MP column there that we're starting to have more and more things that are going to be included in these plans. And that just continues as we sequence through these plans. So the management plans expanded on this even further. Particularly the agricultural sector. This is the first time that we see the option to reduce the top 25% of water duties. This is the first time that we see a requirement for the historic cropping program and also for the Ag BMP program. And there's an option in the statutes for the third management plans to include a cropped acreage program for agriculture or some kind of alternative agricultural conservation program. These third management plan requirements and options are carried forward, at least in largely similar form, from the third management plans to the fourth and fifth management plans. So you start to kind of see this framework, this additive thing coming, this additive structure coming into play throughout this sequence. So as you're considering the fifth management plans and how we're approaching these conservation programs and the strategies we're taking as we think about these conservation programs, some things we must do. We must design to reduce withdrawals of groundwater. We must include conservation requirements for agricultural, municipal, and industrial water users. And we must include agricultural and municipal BMP programs. But we also want to consider, as we've already begun to do in some of our subgroups, whether some of these mays and whether some of these items on the list are something we want to consider as we develop the fifth management plans and as we consider how to move these conservation programs and these management plans into the future. Yeah. So if we could go to the next slide then. So I've talked both kind of big the AMAs and the plans as a whole, and a little more granular about these individual requirements and these individual conservation programs. But we want to take a moment to pull back again and look at the big picture. In the big picture, at the statewide and AMA scale, our conservation strategies have largely been supply side, bringing in additional supplies. But we want to take a moment to consider our definitions and how we approach these conservation programs going forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Carol Ward to do the next section of the presentation. And again, as I mentioned before, we will take questions at the end of her piece of the presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to touch base with all of you again. All right, Amanda, if you could move us to the next slide. Thank you. So, touching on key issues, as the state and our economy continue to grow, and as we look to a drier future, we need to plan for how we continue to make progress towards the management goals. We're working toward the management goals through the management plans. In the context of the plans, we are defining conservation, as Natalie said, as reductions in withdrawals of groundwater. The management plan is unique in that we haven't yet defined the steps that are going to follow it. We expect that there will be a management structure take place, but we don't know what that will look like or when it will take effect. With that in mind, we need to create a fifth management plan that will be interim and that transitions successfully into a drier future that lies ahead of us. Next slide, please, Amanda. So this is the many graphs that Natalie has shared with us as we've reviewed data from the last 30 plus years over the course of our meetings. Inflows, gray bars, are the supply side. Outflows, shown here in the rust color, are the demand. As we have discussed, there have been substantial progress towards the management goals, but much of the progress to date has been on the supply side. Supply side solutions are increasingly limited at this point. Existing supplies are stressed, and new supplies are scarce and costly. If I paraphrase, groundwater isn't magic water. We need to consider what we do on the other side of the equation. On the demand side, to move the AMAs closer to the management goals through the management plan. Slide, please, Amanda. Steiner, who was Arizona's state water engineer in the 70s and ADWR's first director in the 80s, recognized supply augmentation reaching its limits. He saw CAP come online as buying time to balance supply and demand. The Groundwater Management Act established a long-term framework for balancing supply and demand, and management plans play a role in that. On the supply side, the strategy is to meet demand with new resources. In the AMAs, that's been Colorado reclaimed effluent and recharge and recovery. On the side, the strategy is to manage demand to postpone or avoid the need to develop additional resources or to bring use in line with available resources. For the AMAs, that has meant conservation programs designed to achieve reductions and withdrawals of groundwater. Next slide, please. It is important to clarify this point. Per stat, the management plans will include a mandatory conservation program designed to achieve reductions and withdrawals of groundwater. Yes, we're saying that again. This is the contextual definition of conservation that ADWR staff operate under as we work with you, the stakeholders, to build these management plans. And this is why you see this cited and hear it repeated so often. It's the touchstones for our management plans team. We'll come back to conservation in a moment, but I'd like to wrap up with a few more points about demand management in the context of the management plans. Amanda, next slide, please. So demand management comprises a broad range of measures to meet a range of objectives from the short term to the long term. From the point of management plans, this isn't about short curtailment, sudden measures to address crisis, as you already know. We're taking a long-term perspective, building a strategy for long-term wise water use and incremental progress to achieve the management goals. This enables adaptation and steady progress towards the goals and moves towards long-term supply resiliency. Reducing demand stretches existing resources to meet future growth, reduces the need to acquire additional supplies, and reduces costs in the longer term. Next slide, please. Conservation and water efficiency are terms that are often used interchangeably or in ways that are context-specific or audience-dependent. As someone who is specialized on the demand side, it's important to be clear about which context-specific definitions you may be working with in a situation. And the standard definition in the demand field for conservation is the beneficial reduction in water loss, waste, or use, using less or no water. For efficiency, that definition would be the minimization of the amount of water used to accomplish a function, task, or result. Efficiency can certainly contribute to conservation, but it does not always result in conservation. For instance, a homeowner upgrades their irrigation system. It results in more efficient landscape irrigation, reducing their household water use, conservation. On the other hand, a homeowner upgrades their irrigation system, irrigates efficiently, but expands their water-intensive landscaping resulting in greater household water use. It's efficient, but it isn't conservation. Both efficiency and conservation have a role and work together in concert, however, to manage demand and ultimately to achieve the goal of reducing withdrawals of groundwater. Next slide, please, Amanda. Which brings us to the conservation programs. Programs and conservation and efficiency are already existing components of the plans. What can we do to improve upon the existing programs? We want to keep focused on the long term and ensuring we continue to make incremental gains over time into the future, focusing on reductions in withdrawals of groundwater. How can we be more intentional about that? Improved efficiency is an important step forward, but efficiency isn't enough if water use increases or stays flat. Supply increase, system won't balance. Efficiency needs to be paired with conservation in order to meet these goals. The code recognized and incorporated these ideas in the statutory structures, making a distinction between conservation and efficiency in the existing programs. The agricultural program requires conservation that is at least equivalent to that required under the base program. The municipal BMP program requires efficiency equivalent to that assumed under the GPCD program. The two together contribute toward that goal. The idea, of course, was that agriculture would not increase and that the municipal sector would grow on retired agricultural lands. Water demand constant or minimized. Continued efficiency would help support the municipal sector. Next slide, please. All sectors, agricultural, industrial, and municipal, have made significant strides to date in both efficiency and conservation. There is room for continued progress over time, and all sectors can contribute meaningfully to that progress towards the goals. The challenge for all of us as we move forward in this work group is to consider how we can achieve conservation and efficiency in all sectors that is practical and makes progress towards reducing withdrawals of groundwater, remain open to ideas, to invest in the effort, and keeping the big picture goals in mind. Next slide. The fifth plan will also need to have some flexibility built into it to carry us forward and to enable ongoing progress, considering that the statutes don't define what comes after the fifth management plan. That will be, as I said, some sort of continued water management structure, but what exactly that is and the timing of it are yet to be defined. The management plan conservation requirements will remain in place until subsequent requirements become effective. And with that, I'll turn it over to Natalie. We'll be moving on to questions.
Okay. Maggie, do we have any questions that have come in at this point?
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Natalie. We do not have any questions thus far.
Okay. We can go back to questions on this section at the end. We are more than happy to take questions both through the chat box, or you can request to just speak if you prefer to type. We definitely understand that. And McKenna would help you or could help you get unmuted if you needed that. So I'll go ahead and move on to the next section of the presentation. And as I said, if anyone has any questions and wants us to back up, we can absolutely do that as well. All right. So with all that, in the context of these things that we're working toward, we have created subgroups in order to help facilitate these conversations that need to be had in order to facilitate the development that needs to be done for these conservation programs for the fifth management plans. What I'm going to do is through each of those subgroups and just provide a little bit of an update on the goals that we have for each group, the progress that we've made for each group, and what we can anticipate for upcoming meetings for each group. So if you could go to the slide, please, Amanda. Many of you will have seen this slide before. The management plans work group as a whole, we're in a meeting of kind of full work group. This is where all the different subgroups come together. So the goal of this group as a whole, this is a stakeholder forum. We're looking for feedback. We want this to be an open and transparent process where we're gaining insights from the expertise of all of you in order to create these conservation programs in a way that is practical but is also meaningful. So the kind of framework for the conservation programs is that we're reducing withdrawals of groundwater. So that's our guiding principle for all of our subgroup meetings, for all of these conservation programs that we're developing. So the way that we're developing those is kind of, you can see it on the right-hand side of this slide. We are first assessing the data around the existing conservation programs in order that we can update those existing management strategies and use to think about how we might develop new management strategies, whether that be an addition to those existing management strategies or as a whole new conservation program, which I'll touch on in just a little bit. And I mentioned previously in that statutory framework that we have that option to create additional conservation programs under each sector. So if to the next slide, please. I'll start with our municipal subgroup. So in the municipal subgroup, we have been largely focusing so far on, so we had some conversations about the basic structure of the municipal program and also talked about some data, but largely our conversation, largely our conversation in the municipal subgroup has been focused on the non-per capita program. This is a complicated program. There are a lot of BMPs here, so it took us some time to work through each BMP and have a conversation about whether that BMP is good as written, whether we want to edit it, how we do the reporting on those BMPs, and how they kind of fit into the bigger picture of that program. So we still have some work to do on that conversation. At our next upcoming meeting, we anticipate that we'll be talking more big picture for that program, where before we have kind of been in the weeds of each individual BMP. Now we want to start talking about, okay, what do these BMP categories look like? Should we assign points to each category? How do we set the points targets for each tier of water user in that program? So we'll be starting to kind of expand on that conversation that we've been having so far in the subgroup. Additionally, in that subgroup, we will look at the other programs. We'll be looking at how might we update and set new targets under the GPCD program. And we'll also need to have a conversation about the alternative conservation program and if it might be reworked into something that I don't remember if we're at one provider in the program or across all 5 AMAs. So a program that has not been that useful for people. So whether we can rework that program and whether that's more meaningful and more useful for those providers. Our next meeting is on June. All of our meetings, I will say, going forward, assuming any of our meetings are online only until further notice. So at this point, we can assume that meeting will be online only. Does anybody have any questions or comments on the municipal subgroup or any of the conversations that we've been having there? Maggie?
Thank you, Natalie. No comments or questions have come through so far.
Then we can go ahead and move on to ag. If we go to the next up there. Okay, so our agricultural subgroup, we will be meeting on the 18th, so that's our next upcoming meeting, excuse me. In our agricultural subgroup, similar to the municipal subgroup, we've been working through data and our general structure for these programs and kind of trying to do some conversations about what these programs look like. We, similar to the municipal group, we also worked through the BMP program for agriculture and talked through each individual BMP and whether that BMP needs to be reworked and how to assign points for each individual BMP. So I think those conversations are really productive. We've definitely gotten some good feedback, so we appreciate that. We also at our last meeting discussed a concept that we had received from a stakeholder. There was an idea that someone had mentioned about a potential new conservation program for ag that essentially would be some kind of a combined reporting mechanism. So we're looking into that and thinking about and talking about the details of how something like that might work and how we can make it both something that is useful for the agricultural community and also something that fits into this framework of reducing withdrawals of groundwater. So I think there's some real promise to that idea, and it's a great thing, an exciting thing that we have ideas coming in from the agricultural community. Our next meeting is to take a little bit of a step back and go back through some discussion of the data. So demonstrating some of the things that we've talked about in the but maybe haven't clarified the data quite enough, where we're seeing these trends over time that there are differences between the base program and the BMP program, and understanding those differences and how we might respond to those differences in the details of those programs. So we are a little bit more time on the data in our next agricultural subgroup meeting. And then after that meeting, we hope to get back into a little bit more of the conversations about both how we might adjust the BMP program going forward and how we might consider this concept for an additional conservation program or other ideas that might be out there for these programs. So do we have any questions on all of that?
Thank you, Natalie. No questions so far.
Great. All right. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide then. Thank you, Amanda. So we do have an industrial subgroup, at least in theory. We had one meeting of our industrial subgroup for the 5th management plans back in September. We pretty promptly at that subgroup that's just broad industrial conversation. That sector is just very complex. There's a lot of variation between the subsectors. So we recommended to have subsector level breakout groups. We can certainly come back and meet with that industrial level subgroup again if there's a need for it, or if there's some conversations that might be better handled at that level. But for now, we're kind of planning on going forward with this subgroup level, subsector level approach for the industrial sector. That said, we have at this point only created one subsector work group, breakout group, which is for turf. So if there are other subsectors that are open to having conversations with us that would like to work with us on whether working through updating these conservation strategies for the other subsectors, we are certainly looking for that type of interaction and looking for that type of feedback as we work through updating these conservation strategies for the fifth management plan. Yeah, so let's go to the next slide. So for the turf breakout group, the turf breakout group has been a little bit unique. We did spend a little bit of time on data, but we've spent a lot of time on changes that occurred for the newest set of fourth management plans. So we just adopted the Phoenix fourth management plan. We're working to adopt the Pinal and Santa Cruz fourth management plan later this year. And there's a set of changes that are occurring in those management plans that we wanted to use this forum to describe more fully. So it's been some time in the turf breakout group describing those changes to those three fourth management plans. We also spent a lot of time talking about the existing conservation program. Something we recognize about the existing turf conservation programs is that it is incredibly complex and it can be very confusing even for a golf course to calculate their conservation allotment if they're going to be making any changes. So kind of through conversations, we laid out some goals for the fifth management plan conservation program for turf. One of which is that it be more simple, that it's something that's understandable, something that is easier to manage both on our side and for the water users. There's a lot of layers of complexity in that program that we're kind of working to unwind, but we are hoping to bring some ideas with that regard to the next turf breakout meeting. Other requests that we heard through those conversations is that the fifth management plan conservation program be really data driven, that we look at those application rates and look at whether the science supports those application rates and include some acknowledgement of the existence of overseeding in those application rates. So we are looking at how those application rates are structured. We are working with stakeholders to find and obtain data on those application rates. And we are assessing what the impacts of those types of change might have on the A scale for the conservation program as a whole, to make sure that's also checking that box of reducing withdrawals of groundwater. I think we have a really, there's some direction we can go that are really promising with that regard. So we're hoping to have a really good conversation in this next turf breakout group at the end of June, on the 22nd of June, to start discussing that fifth management plan conservation program might look like as we kind of work to take it apart and rebuild it. So it's definitely been one of our more complicated conversations, but it's definitely one that we're looking forward to making some progress in, and I think is an area where we can see significant improvement. Are there any questions or comments on the turf conservation program or the turf subgroup?
Thank you, Natalie. I'm not seeing any questions or comments come through yet.
All right. This might be a quick meeting if Carol and I are the only ones talking. That's right too. All right, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. This next subgroup that I'm going to cover, the last subgroup that I'm going to cover here, is the safe yield technical subgroup. So kind of the goal of this group was to look at safe yield and how we analyze safe yield both on an annual and on a long basis. Looking at each of the components, looking at that annual calculation, looking at the long-term analysis of safe yield, and for that matter, long-term analysis of all of the goals of the AMAs, because there are some differences between those goals for each AMA. So we've made really good progress in this group. I think we've had some really interesting conversations. In our past meetings in this particular group, we have gone through each of the components of safe yield and had a discussion about what's the source data for that component. Should we think about the source data for that differently? Should we include other components? Do we need to think about any of these things differently and update the way we think about safe yield? We have worked through all of our components for that annual calculation. I think we're close to being able to move on from that annual calculation of safe yield and move into some conversations about the long-term analysis of safe yield. We introduced at our last meeting, our most recent meeting on the safe yield technical group, we introduced some concepts of how we might think about analyzing the long-term analysis for safe yield. This is a thing that is really complicated, and we have been saying it's complicated for a long time and maybe not going into a lot of the details. So it's been a really interesting experience to dig into those details and help everybody understand why this thing is complicated, and maybe it's not really complicated and that's okay, but we can figure out some ways to both analyze and talk about it in ways that are really clear and communicate the status of each AMA with regard to its goal, whether that be safe yield or something else. So we've really made progress in this group. I think there's some really interesting ideas and interesting conversations happening with regard to the long-term analysis and with regard to how we communicate this. So I'm personally excited to see where this goes and some of the progress that we'll continue to make in our future meetings. Our next meeting, that group will continue to talk about those concepts that we introduced at the last meeting regarding the long-term analysis of safe yield. So we'll be digging into some of those details in our next meeting, and also moving into thinking more about how we talk about safe yield and how best we can communicate the status of each AMA with regard to its goal. So that next meeting is on July 7th. And I will say I've had the dates for each of these meetings on the slides, but each of those meetings is both on our 5MP webpage on the ADWR's website, and they are all on the ADWR's public meetings calendar as well. Are there any questions about this subgroup?
Thank you, Natalie. No questions or comments so far. Oh, sorry, I just had one come through. Patrick has commented, 2 of the 5 MP work group objectives are related to management strategies. Can you talk more about some specific management strategies that may potentially be updated? Could you also give some examples on new management strategies that ADWR has identified?
Thanks, Patrick. And I don't know if Carol wants to jump in here at all. But so something we're thinking about in terms of specific management strategies. So our previous management strategies being kind of the details of these things that are written into each of the consultation programs. So one example of a new management strategy is this potential new conservation program that's been we've had this idea for that someone gave us this idea for agriculture. So without getting too far into the weeds of it, what the idea of this would be to allow for some combined reporting for agriculture And kind of as for the trade-off of that would be that aggregated combined reporting would take, the IGFRs associated with that combined reporting would take a cut to their total allotment, some percentage that is yet to be determined. Again, this is just a concept, but we're looking for these types of kind of out-of-the-box ideas to help us think about how we reduce withdrawals of groundwater while also serving the needs of, while also fitting the needs and being practical for those water users in each individual sector. So making sure that these strategies are both updated, but are also fitting the needs of a given sector and are working to being productive and reducing withdrawals of groundwater. That's really what we're looking at here. So maybe that's just one example, but those are the types of things that we're trying to look for in each sector where we can make things better on both sides while still conserving water. Question was, can you talk about some specific management strategies that may potentially be updated? Could you also give some examples on new management strategies that ADWR has identified? Good. All right. So hopefully that answered your question. Do we have other questions or comments on safe yield or any of these other items?
I'm not showing any additional comments or questions right now.
Well, thank you, Patrick, for a comment. We appreciate it. We can go ahead then and move on to the next slide. So I will say for our 5MP timeline, we, at the beginning of this process, laid out a timeline to try to wrap up a lot of these conversations we're having around the end of this year. Obviously, with all the many things that are going on right now, a lot of those timelines are a little more tentative than they ever were. So I will just say we have not changed that timeline at this point, but we do consider it to be kind of tentative, potentially fluid. As we work through more of these conversations over the next few months, we will kind of keep you all updated on whether we'll be adjusting those timelines at all. So we can go ahead and go to the next, please. So, as I said before, our here are to assess the existing conservation programs, update our existing programs and strategies, and develop any new management programs and strategies that we might need in order to take us into the future for the 5th management plans. We have really kind of, in most of our subgroups, we're largely working, largely have completed, largely have worked through the data portions and are kind of getting more into the strategies and policy portions of these conversations. We're wanting to apply that data and be specific about where we're focusing those efforts. But we're definitely moving into a phase where we're talking more on the policy and the conservation side rather than just looking at the existing programs and our past progress. So could move on to the next slide, please. This was our initial timeline, working through the program analysis and the program development over the course of this year so that we could spend 2021 writing the 5 5th management plans and 2022 adopting those 5 5th management plans. That is all with a goal of those conservation programs becoming effective on January 1st, 2025. As Carol mentioned earlier, the 4th management plans will remain in effect until the 5th management plans take place, and the management plans remain in effect until something else takes their place. We did have a target of at least adopting those by 2025. As I said, this is this is maybe more tentative than it was a few months ago, but we're certainly still working toward this timeline and hoping that we can meet a lot of this timeline. So we are moving quickly. We know we have an aggressive schedule of meetings, but we do appreciate all of the participation that we've had from the stakeholders. We've had really engaged participants, really engaged feedback and ideas throughout all of the process. We did want to thank everybody for the time that they've spent and the feedback that they've provided throughout this process. So if we could move on to the next slide. We do have upcoming meetings, again, kind of an aggressive schedule of meetings. But all of these meetings are, as I said, on the 5MP page of our website. That page does have all of our meeting information for our scheduled future meetings and also for our past meetings, including the recordings and presentations for each meeting. So if you miss a meeting, you can always catch up on that webpage. And all of these meetings, in addition to ADWR's many other public meetings, are all available on ADWR's public meetings calendar on our website. So with that, we can go on to the next slide. So that's all we had for the presentation today. Maggie, were there any last minute questions before we wrap up here?
Thank you, Natalie. I'm not seeing anything come through.
All right. Quiet group, yes. And that's okay. So we would be glad to take any thoughts or feedback that you all might have in response to any of this. I know we threw a lot of information at you throughout the course of this presentation, but we do appreciate your time. Please feel free to email me directly, to send a message to our management plans at azwater.gov email address. We very much appreciate all of the feedback that we've gotten. We appreciate the participation that we've had throughout this process. So thank you for that, and hopefully we will hear from you all soon. Thank you for logging in today.